Okay, class. So I've talked a lot, or I've tried to contextualize what's going on from the Soviet point of view. Tried to contextualize Snyder's discussion of collectivization, the rise of the Bolsheviks, the capture of Moscow, the creation of the Soviet Union, which was an empire, really a nation made up of 15 other nations, including, most importantly, the Russia, but also places like Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, the nationalities that are pretty much all free today, although Ukraine's under threat today, that became part of the Soviet Union. The focus, the obsession on Ukraine because it's such an important source of food that really begins in World War I when Germany, for a brief period, captures Ukraine and then loses it when it surrenders in November of 1918. The attempt of the Soviet government to capture Poland, it fails. The Soviets sign a treaty with Poland. They're not too happy about it. They're very unhappy about it because, first of all, they thought that Poland was ripe for revolution, but the Polish government was able to turn back the Soviet army in the early 1920s. You had Ukrainians becoming part of Polish sovereignty, but on the other side of it, you had some Poles, ethnic Poles, becoming part of the Soviet Union. And Stalin, especially, is very, very paranoid about Poles in the Soviet Union. He distrusts them as an ethnicity. He thinks they're a fifth column, that they're about to undermine him. And he doesn't trust Poland at all. And he kind of fears Poland. And as you'll see in the Snyder book, in addition to the horrible starvation that you see in the collectivization, you also see the mass murder of Poles as well, which is separate from collectivization. So keep that in your mind. You have the collectivization, which I'm going to talk about in this podcast. You can watch a short video on. But then you also have the Great Purge, which is Stalin murdering his perceived enemies, including and especially Poles, but also members of his political rivals, some of his military he's come to distrust. And really, one of the key points I want you to take from the course is by 1940, Stalin had murdered millions more through collectivization, through starvation, through the Great Purge, through executions, than did Hitler. Although tragically, of course, Hitler will catch up very quickly after 1940. But this is one of the points that Snyder wants to make in his book when he's looking at both of them and the interactions and how entangled they were. Okay, so Joseph Stalin, he is part of the Bolshevik leadership class. He's from the Republic of Georgia, which is in the southern part of the Soviet Union. When he's a young man, he's a bank robber. He's a very, very tough guy. He becomes in the inner circle of the Bolsheviks. In the 1920s, Lenin dies, and Stalin basically outwits his political opponents, such as Trotsky, and he outmaneuvers them. And by the late 1920s, he is in control of the Soviet government, this tight circle of Bolsheviks, the Politburo that runs the Soviet government. And its power is buttressed by a very, very efficient and ruthless and bloody secret police that is more than willing to execute anyone that Stalin wants executed. So by the 1920s, Joseph Stalin has become basically the dictator of Russia. He's arguing that what he's trying to do is keep the dream of the Marxist revolution, this idea of creating a workers' paradise. He's trying to fulfill it. That's why he has to do the dirty things that he has to do, because there are so many enemies that are surrounding this dream, that are surrounding the Soviet Union, that he has to create both internally and externally, that he has to create a ruthless police force in order to make sure that this dream remains alive. And he's a brilliant propagandist, and he's surrounded by brilliant propagandists, and he gains very, very tight control over the Soviet government. He answers to Politburo, but in essence, he's the dictator. It's a one-man rule in the Soviet Union. Now, Stalin wants to industrialize the Soviet Union. This is goal number one for him. The reason that he wants to industrialize it is this is a fulfillment of Marx's dream. You can't create a worker's paradise until you industrialize, your nation becomes an industrial giant. And in the 1920s and 1930s, the Soviet Union was actually the biggest sector in the Soviet Union was the agricultural sector, not the industrial sector. The Soviet Union was very, very late getting to industrialization. The United States, Western Europe got there at least 50 years earlier, if not before. And in fact, Stalin adopts some techniques from the United States, including mass production techniques from Ford Motor, and he adopts them for the Soviet Union. So he adopts some capitalist techniques that are very, very efficient in order to industrialize Russia. So that's his goal number one. It's part of his ideological goal, the goal of the communist. But the other thing is that it's very important for Stalin that Russia become more industrialist than agricultural, because you can't become a first-rate power if you're not an industrial power. There's in the 20th century, there's no first-rate power that puts agriculture first. You have to have an industry, at the very least, to create military supplies such as tanks and guns and battleships and everything that comes with creating a modern army. And so you have to create an industrial society. So in the late 20s and early 1930s, Stalin basically declares war on his agricultural sector, especially but not exclusively in places like Ukraine. That he wants to gain control over the agricultural. He doesn't want there to be small independent farmers. He doesn't want capitalism. He doesn't want competition. So collectivization is just like the root of it sounds. Agriculture, in his dream anyway, becomes a collective endeavor where farmers, instead of having, say, 50 farmers in one rural area, you would have one large farm. So he doesn't want small farms. He wants the state to control huge collectivist agricultural areas, because he assumes that this will be more efficient. He assumes that the state will be more efficient if it collectivizes agriculture. Now, the problem is that these large units of productions that would be based on modernized equipment, such as tractors. So in some ways, what you're seeing here is industrialization moves into the rural areas with things such as tractors and other kind of advanced industrial mechanical goods that help for the production of things like wheat would move into the field. But Stalin also feels like there's an enemy in rural Russia, especially in Ukraine. And this is something that you'll be tested on. So this is something that you should know. He believes I'm showing a short video that I want you to watch. He believes that the kulaks have to be destroyed. And who are the kulaks? The kulaks are the wealthier peasants. They're the peasants that own land and hire other farmers. So they're the upper class of the peasant community in Russia. They're the ones that own most of the land. They're the ones that employ most of the workers. And Stalin sees them as his deadly enemy, that he needs to destroy them. And I have a image up here, if you're looking at this on a screen. The upper class peasants, the kulaks, the folks that own land, that hire a smaller group, poorer peasants, they have to be destroyed if the Soviet state is going to capture the agricultural sector of the Soviet Union. And again, the point of capturing the agricultural sector is there's two things. You can use those agricultural goods to sell to places like Germany. The biggest supplier of food to Germany before World War II was the Soviet Union. And that's one of the reasons that Stalin thought that Germany would never invade the Soviet Union, because Germany was getting a lot of its food from the Soviet Union. Of course, Hitler has another plan. He just wants to take over Ukraine, right? But anyway, so the Soviets are selling agricultural goods to other countries to get money, to seed money to build their industrial economy. And so he's forefronting and promoting industry over agriculture. And he feels like he needs to take over the agricultural sector. Now, when I talk about this, sometimes I feel like I'm like a Stalin apologist. Believe me, I'm not. But, as a historian, we have to explain what these folks are thinking. And believe me, I'm quite appalled by his behavior, by his actions, by his whole philosophy and all that. So horrifying, horrifying, horrifying. So anyway, I'm not a Stalin apologist. I'm just talking about where you just got to know where people are coming from, as bad as it is. So yeah, if I ever sound like I'm being an apologist, I'm not, I promise you. So he wants to collectivize. There's slaughter of livestock. There's all kinds of resistance, like slaughter of livestock to the collectivization. The peasants they don't want the state to come over, to come into their territory, which they have farmed for generations. They don't want the Soviet state to run things now. So there's fierce resistance to the collectivization process. And you know what? I'm just there's a short video that I'm going to show you, which does a better job. It's only 15 minutes. It does a better job of talking about the collectivization and how deadly it was than any lecture that I could give you. Plus, it has images, which are always more powerful. I just want to make one point. This is the last podcast of today. Snyder talks about collectivization and the millions of Ukrainians that died when the Soviet state comes in and takes over the agricultural sector in Ukraine. And you can better believe the Ukrainians remember collectivization. But there's more to Stalin's murders than collectivization. By the late 1930s, Stalin is also involved in what's called the Great Purge. It comes out of his paranoia. It comes out of his obsession that he has to stomp out any opponents. This is where a number of ethnic Poles are caught up in a web and executed just because they're a wrong ethnicity. They speak the wrong language, and because Stalin fears them. But also he kills a number of his former allies. He purges his army. A student mentioned it in class the other day. A good portion of his generals are caught up in this web because Stalin was afraid that they would lead the army against him in a revolution. So they're caught up in the web. They're executed as well. So what you'll be reading in this chapter, mostly it's about the collectivization, but it's also about the class warfare, the killing of ethnic Poles especially, and the killing of folks that Stalin perceives as his enemies. Now, Hitler makes an appearance in Snyder's book as well, but I'm going to lecture on that on Monday. I wanted to focus this lecture on Stalin because I think that's a much less familiar story for most of you. So I'm going to end my part of the lecture here. I'm going to post a good video on collectivization, and be sure to watch it because you'll be tested on it. But watch it because it makes you more informed about the past. And really, isn't that why you're in the class, right? I don't really need to be coercive, do I? I just want to make you smarter and more informed. That's my job, and that's why you're at UTSA. Okay, have a good week or whenever you're listening to this, and I will see you in class on Monday.